Hello, this is Graham and thanks for joining me in part 4 of this video tutorial series covering the Panasonic Lumix FZ200 camera. In this video I want to cover the remaining semi-automatic modes, that's the Aperture Priority and Shutter Priority mode, and then we'll go on to consider using the full manual mode and what that gives you in terms of creativity by using the ISO, the shutter speed and the aperture to give you the desired photo you need. Let's begin by looking at why we would consider using the Aperture Priority mode. By using Aperture Priority mode, we dial in the specific aperture we want to take the picture with. So for example, if I wanted the shallowest depth of field, I might want to use the widest aperture lens setting that the camera gives me, and that's f2.8. Combine this with a longer focal length will give me the very shallowest depth of field I can possibly get. So if I'm trying to create a picture where I want the subject to be sharply in focus and throw the background fairly well out of focus, I will consider using a longer focal length and a wider aperture. Conversely to that, if I wanted to take a landscape and I wanted the maximum depth of field, then I would use the wider angle setting, so that would be the 24mm end, and I would use the f8 setting to give me the maximum depth of field. So by using a combination of lens aperture and lens focal length, we can govern the amount of depth of field we create in our photographs. Conversely, if we use the Shutter Priority mode, we dial in the shutter speed we want to take the picture with. And we would do that, for example, if we were a sports photographer and wanted to capture action. With a very short shutter speed, we can stop any subject motion. If you wanted to create some dreamy seascapes or riverscapes, then if you use a longer shutter speed, it will allow the river to pass by and give you a blurred effect. That's why this is a fantastic hobby. It gives you the creative control of the photograph you're trying to capture, whether you want to capture the river with that silky smooth appearance, or whether you want to capture it with the droplets of water spraying off rocks to give you that intense feeling of what nature's doing with the river. That's why I love this hobby. It is such a fantastic hobby to give you that creative control. Let's begin now then by looking at Aperture Priority mode, how to select it on the camera, and some of the options in the menu you might want to consider tweaking to give you the best result in Aperture Priority mode. Then we'll switch over to Shutter Priority mode and I'll try and demonstrate some of the effects that the shutter speed has on the final image. We'll then go through to the full manual mode where we'll explore the relationship between the ISO, the shutter speed and the aperture to give us the type of exposure we need for our photographs. Okay, to engage the Aperture Priority mode, I'm going to turn the top control dial to give me the Aperture Priority position, which is marked by the A symbol. And again, the LCD will display the fact that we changed to the Aperture Priority mode, and it's indicated on the screen by the A icon. Here on the screen you can see that at the moment I've got my aperture set to f2.8, my ISO is set to ISO 100 to give me the best possible image conditions, and generally I tend to shoot with -1/3 EV just to retain any highlights in the subject. Shooting with 16:9 9-megapixel format, as that's the style I use for all my stills for inclusion into HD video. I've actually set up for manual focus, so I can actually focus first of all on the first pawn in this series of 8. I'm doing that to indicate the amount of depth of field with this lens set at its widest aperture, which is f2.8, and the lens has got a fair amount of zoom on it. The actual zoom is probably times 15, so we're probably halfway between the 24mm and the 600mm equivalent of the lens. So the depth of field is quite shallow, and you can probably see on the image that the first pawn is nice and sharply in focus, and then you get a gradual tail off to the back pawn, and that is the result of the depth of field. If I take that first image, we can have a look at that in the video to highlight that point. If I do nothing else now but just change the aperture to f8, we will see the amount of depth of field will increase, and it will increase to include more of these pawns in focus. So I'm going to adjust the aperture because that's now selected with the control dial and the icon is in yellow, so that means I have control of the aperture, and I'm going to use the back control wheel to select f8. So now the camera is selecting f8 and we'll get much more depth of field. And if I half depress the shutter button, you should see on the display that the image becomes sharper towards the rear of the photograph. I'll take that picture so again we can look at that in the video. And there you can see we have more depth of field between the first and the last of the pawn in the series. In reality, if I wanted to capture this scene with the front pawn and the rear pawn in more detailed focus, then I wouldn't be setting the focus on the first pawn, I would be setting approximately a third of the way into the scene, and this is using what's called the hyperfocal distance. And the hyperfocal distance gives you maximum depth of field for any given aperture and focal length. So what I'm going to do is change my focus position to between the third and the fourth pawn so that I'll have this pawn in focus and hopefully most of the background in focus. So I'll change my focus position to the third pawn by changing the manual focus assist target area, and then we'll adjust the focus to focus on that point. About there. So you can now see that the image is in focus here, it's out of focus at the front of the image, and it's out of focus at the back of the image. So when I now take the photograph with the f8 aperture, we'll include more of this in focus and we'll include more of the last pawn in focus. So I'll take that image and we can have a look at that in the video. The menu options for both the aperture and shutter priority modes are exactly the same as those for the P mode, so I won't go into any more detail at this point in the video to save some time. So in essence, aperture priority mode allows you to select the depth of field you want by selecting the aperture and focal length combination. Let's now look at shutter priority mode, where we can actually determine the amount of subject motion by selecting an appropriate shutter speed. So we'll now turn to the shutter mode priority mode, which is S, and again we do that by turning the top control dial to the S position, and that's indicated again on the LCD screen, and we end up with the S icon. You now notice on the display that we're now controlling the shutter speed, and if I use the top control dial, you can see that I can change the shutter speed. As I do so, the camera will change the aperture automatically for me to maintain the correct exposure. I'm going to change the scene to one where there's some subject motion so we can attempt to stop that in this particular video. I've set up Newton's cradle as a method to demonstrate the effects of shutter speed on image motion. We're in shutter priority mode. The top control dial is now affecting the shutter speed, and you can see that I've got it set for a 13th of a second. I'm going to start Newton's cradle in operation and then try and capture a still image. So I'm going to try and capture the image of the two balls being deflected out from the cradle. I think you can see from that image that the shutter speed is so long that during the time the shutter is open, the subject has moved appreciably, and that gives us the blurred effect. If I wanted to freeze that motion, I'm going to have to use a faster shutter speed to enable the shutter to open and close in such a time that during that period the subject hasn't moved at all. It might mean that I have to raise the ISO to get that shutter speed. So I'm going to raise it to ISO 400 to give me an extra 2 stops worth of exposure. And I'm going to try a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second. Just checking we have enough exposures, and the indication is that we still show we have exposure latitude as the display hasn't gone red. And I'll start Newton's cradle off again. And again, I'll try and capture the ball swinging out to one side. If I increase the ISO by one more stop to ISO 800, then I should be able to change my shutter speed to 1/500th of a second, and that will stop the image even further. So by increasing my ISO, I can now change my shutter speed to 1/500th, and again we're back to f2.8 because of the exposure triangle. So let's try this one again. We can look at those in the video just to show the difference between the 1/250th and 1/500th versus the trade-off of using a higher ISO and the possibility of some noise appearing in those still images. We'll now switch to the full manual mode, and that gives the control of the ISO, shutter speed and aperture independently to achieve our exposure. To engage manual mode, turn the top control dial to the M position, and again the LCD screen shows that for you. And again we end up with the M icon, which indicates that you're in the manual exposure mode. On the back of the camera we can now see the aperture, which is f7.1, the shutter speed, which is 1/15th of a second, and the ISO, which I've got set to ISO 100. And in the manual mode, the key to getting the exposure is the exposure scale here on the bottom of the camera, which goes from -3 to +3, and each bar that comes up is a third of an increment. So if I turn the shutter speed, you can see that as I lengthen the shutter, we overexpose the subject, and that's indicated by the exposure scale. If I go on the other side, we're now underexposing by an equivalent amount of 1/3 for every rotation of the dial. So theoretically, when you're in the middle, the exposure is correct. But again, it depends on the subject itself, and experience will tell you when you need to over or underexpose compared to what the camera is telling you. Here the scene has got a predominance of white background, so I know the image will come out slightly underexposed if I don't compensate for that. So I'd normally use a plus exposure correction if I know that my subject will be degraded by the fact we've got this bright background, and the degree of correction will depend on the size of the subject compared to the background. You've noticed now that as I adjust the shutter speed, we can change the exposure, and if I depress the top control dial, it switches me over to aperture control, and again I can control the aperture to determine the correct exposure. So I can use a combination of both of those. So for example, if I wanted to use f4 and I dial up f4 on the camera, you can see that the exposure indicator is telling me that we are now overexposed. To correct that, I can either change the ISO to a lower value, and I can't go lower than this in the camera, so I can now change the shutter speed to a higher value to correct the exposure. So again, by pressing the top control dial in, I can get access to change the shutter speed, and as I shorten the shutter speed now, you can see that I can bring the camera back to the perfect exposure point. If I wanted to use f8 and 1/60th of a second, for example, so if I use the control dial to select f8 and 1/60th, you can see that I am underexposed, and I wanted to use the 60th of a second to arrest some motion in the picture. I wanted to use f8 to get the maximum depth of field, so the only way I can correct the exposure now is to use the ISO. And again, by just depressing the ISO on the camera, going from ISO 100 to 200 gives me one stop, and going from ISO 200 to 400 gives me two stops of exposure. So if I select that now, you can see that I brought the exposure back to the correct exposure point. So with this exposure of ISO 400, 1/60th of a second and f8, I have the same exposure. And if I take that image, we can compare that. And you can see from that exposure that the image was slightly underexposed, so I would need to increase the ISO slightly if I wanted to get the correct exposure. So again, by going into ISO, I can go to say ISO 500, which will give me a third of a stop overexposed. I'm going to go for 2/3 EV overexposure to get what I think will be the correct exposure with this light background. So I'll take that image. You can see that image was better than the indicated image on the screen now. Let's go back and change the ISO back to 100. And to balance the equation, we would now need to change the shutter speed to a longer exposure to allow more light to reach the sensor during that period of time. So if I now go to +2 thirds EV over, I'm using 1/10 of a second, and providing there was no subject motion, you'd be okay to take that picture. So let's do that as a comparison, and we could see the difference in the pictures will be the noise, as the trade-off between using a higher ISO is the fact you'll get noise in the picture. So when you're using manual exposure, it's always a case of determining which is the highest priority in the picture, whether you want low noise, no subject motion, or depth of field. You may have been looking at the image of this camera on your screen and thinking what's different, and it's in fact this ring that I fitted around the four-way navigation control. What I was finding was that when I was gripping the camera like so, and if I was trying to make an adjustment with the top thumb wheel or using the zoom, quite often this part of my thumb was contacting the white balance switch, and it was enabling the white balance. So when I thought I was going to be adjusting exposure value compensation, I was actually changing the color temperature, and it was just an annoying factor. So I thought, well, the only way around this is to prevent the depression of the four-way navigation button by putting a garter ring around it. And now it's much more difficult for me to actually engage the white balance switch without actually using a thumbnail to go in there to change it. The actual material is a fibre disc that's normally used in plumbing fittings to seal brass fittings. I just had to file the inside edge of that to make it fit over the cursor control, and I just used double-sided adhesive to hold it to the camera. And now I find that I can handle the camera without touching that white balance control, and I'm more happy now with the camera. So it's maybe something you might want to consider if you too find that you keep catching the white balance control when you're handling the camera. Well, that's it for this video, covering the aperture priority, shutter priority, and some of the manual facilities the camera has. In the next video, I'll be looking at shooting video with the camera. So we'll be looking at the choices between AV-CHD and MPEG-4, which one you should actually choose, and we'll be looking at some of the hints and tips that I've discovered by using the camera for video, and then using external microphones to give you better audio. So until then, thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in that video. Bye for now.